We have with us Mr. Brad Staples, CEO of APCO, speaking exclusively to NDTV. Mr. Staples, thank you so much for taking out the time speaking to me.
Well, Gaurie, it's lovely to be with you.
So we speak at a time when there is a huge push towards semiconductor manufacturing by the government. There's an expectation that this could lead to big ticket investments. First of all, I want your thoughts on a very consistent effort being made by the government. There are proposals, there are committed investment proposals that are in place, but how do you see India's semiconductor journey?
What I've been excited about and inspired by in the conversations we've been having here as part of the US-India Business Council's board meeting and the Ideas Summit that's taking place is there's a different perspective in terms of the United States relationship with India in the tech sector. Whether it's semiconductors or it's beyond that there is US capital coming to India excited and determined to be part of a new stage in India's tech sector development. It's the era of outsourcing is long past, and we have innovation at a large scale and a real commitment here to build a complementary relationship in the tech space between the United States and India. And the semiconductor sector is right at the heart of that. And we've got large-scale US semiconductor investments now taking place in this country. I think there's a warm response in the West to the Honourable Prime Minister's design and desire to see greater investment in the semiconductor space.
It's a long journey, and you know, there are levels and layers as far as the semiconductor investment trajectory is concerned. But in your assessment, if we were to do a 5-year down the line kind of a scenario building, where do you see India on the semiconductor tech ladder, so to say, taking care of the lower end, the design element, or do you see maybe making more strides given the tech partnerships that it's actively looking at with US?
I think if you look at these tech partnerships now, they're everything from research and development through design and manufacturing on a highly sophisticated, large-scale sort of footprint. India won't be the only place that the world secures its semiconductors for the future from. It's going to need large-scale investments in other parts of the world, in like-minded nations, so that we reduce this dependency on Taiwan that we have presently. And you see large-scale investments from groups like Apple in Europe as well, in countries like Germany, where they're building large-scale semiconductor manufacturing, as well as in India. So I think India will be part of a new mix of nations that are playing a strategically essential role to secure this new Gen AI era that we're entering.
Interesting you mentioned that. I want to ask one last question as far as semiconductors specifically before we move on to the larger investment landscape in India, which is the tailwinds that it's having right now. The US-China chip war that is taking place. How big a push that could be in terms of the tailwinds that India's semiconductor industry needs? Do you see that really being a facilitator? Because it comes at the backdrop of US asking some of its other allies also, whether Japan or Netherlands and others, to try and limit access of technology to China. How does that add up for India or help India?
I think it helps India because there's a strategic imperative to move quickly, clearly, and to have these critical contributors to the development of the semiconductor sector work with a greater level of collaboration than we've seen in the past. And the Dutch play a critical role in that, absolutely critical role in that. So I think it helps, it focuses minds, it accelerates investment, and it shows a level of determined diplomatic and strategic alignment. But it's the semiconductor sector, and it takes time to develop this infrastructure and to create the skills that are needed to produce high-quality product that will be essential from India. So I think it sets it is a tailwind, but we also have to look at these longer-term timeframes.
What would you want from the government to really focus on after putting money on the table? Because that is an imperative. That's a necessary but not a sufficient condition. So what would you want the government to now focus on?
I think it's a blend of several things. To accelerate that investment, it requires an enlightened regulatory environment, the most favorable fiscal conditions to encourage investment, a sure and determined commitment to remain a close partner with the United States and with partner countries across the globe, and I think just a willingness to embrace private sector investment, as well as deploying all the assets and resources that India has, both at a national and at a state level.
Okay. And if one were to talk about the importance of India in terms of the larger global economic landscape, where would you put that? Because it also comes at a time when the US economy is also seeing some robust signs of recovery, at a time when the Chinese economy is struggling. So how would you see India in the larger global economic landscape right now?
I think India represents, from a consumer perspective, one of the most exciting emerging marketplaces for Western service providers as well as manufacturers. There's been a period of predictability over the last two administrations of the Prime Minister. We now have a different tone and context to this administration, but there is certainty and consistency in the way that this country is governed, and there is I think an environment that it excites future investors in all sectors. So I think India represents a welcome home for investments that might have gone to China before, and a place where there's greater certainty and security from a political perspective than we see in other developed nations. We've had periods of political turmoil across many markets, certainly many of the Western European markets, and others that are still struggling with slow growth. We've got 8+% growth in this country. It's unparalleled in the West.
You speak to large corporates, investors around the world, and in terms of advising them on where to really put their money on. You mentioned some of the pluses that work for India, but talk to us about the sectors where you see the maximum excitement when it comes to coming to India.
I think the digital infrastructure that this country has put in place has been revolutionary in terms of the pace and the nature of what's happened. Aadhaar and creating that digitized payment systems across the whole country in a very inclusive way excites the fintech sector. It enables those that are providing database technology and new services to this country. Suddenly India becomes a 1.4 billion person sandbox for innovators and those that are looking to really drive a new era in financial services in particular. Mm-hmm. So that's one area that I see a huge amount of excitement and interest in India. There's still a certain uncertainty about the position government takes on some topics, but I've been very, very reassured being here over the last few days, talking to a number of...
Which are those topics?
Well, I think when you look at the approach that India will take to regulate AI in the future, create the right regulatory and ethics-based approach to enabling innovation in that sector, I think there is a real desire to see this country take a path that's a little different to that seen in North America and in Europe. There is a clear desire here to regulate in a way that deals with cases as they emerge in a reactive rather than a predictive way.
Is that a bad thing?
No, I think it's a very good thing for investors. I think it's a very good thing if those in the technology sector see that government is a partner enabling innovation and then dealing with these complex issues which still haven't fully emerged at a time that they do and in a context in which they become a problem, rather than taking an ex-ante or more predictive approach.
And given that AI is still an evolving issue, the fact that some of the developing countries are still grappling with the aspects of AI, do you see the approach that India takes could have sort of set a template for some of the other developing countries, the global south, to follow as far as AI and digital infrastructure is concerned?
Without any question. I can't see another model that works better for those emerging economies in Africa, those economies that are still sluggish in Latin America, and in this neighborhood. It represents such an attractive economy to invest and to partner with. And I think for other countries, there really is no other model that mirrors what India has done, either in terms of scale, scope, pace at which it's been applied, and the extremely positive uptake in this country.
Also at a time where a lot of people would say that the West is really trying to clamp down on big tech. We can have a separate conversation altogether on big tech altogether, but how does that play out with how India is trying to deal with it? Because they are two completely different approaches, isn't it?
I think it is, but I think India benefits from watching what's happened in the West and from seeing the extraordinary innovation and ideas that can come from the big Silicon Valley hyperscalers. They are companies that can be trusted partners, and yet India can watch and see the scale and the dominant position that can emerge in some areas. So I think India has a wonderful opportunity to observe the best and address some of the issues that are causing challenges at the moment in the West.
And which brings me to my last two questions, which are slightly on the geopolitical aspect, because at the end of the day, everything is a subset of what's happening around us. And there are two wars that are taking place, the Russia-Ukraine and of course the ongoing one in Gaza as well. In one, India is expected, or it's hoped that India could play a significant role. How do you see that in terms of India's ability, position, to be able to at least bring the two warring partners and parties on the negotiating table? I'm talking about Russia, Ukraine.
I think India has a critical role to play. There are few countries that have the authority and the influence that India has to potentially convene all other critical parties to that table. Whether this is done in partnership with China, whether it's done separately, Russia is going to need to feel that it has a convener at the table that it knows well, has confidence that will look fairly at the outcome that will come to this conflict. And Ukraine too needs to know that although this won't be the US or an allied country, it's one that is
balanced and fair.
Independent, fair, rational, balanced, and broadly trusted by all sides. There are very few other candidates than India to take this on. It was very good to see the Honourable Prime Minister in Kiev just recently, I think laying some foundation stones to potentially what we would all hope would be a positive outcome, or as positive an outcome as one could have.
President Putin also mentioned after that India could be one among the countries after the visit.
Right. Absolutely, after that visit, yeah. It was good to see President Zelensky welcome Narendra Modi in that way.
And then let me then ask you about the not just the war as far as Gaza is concerned, but India's push in the Middle East. You know, whether you take the corridor, the IMEC, whether you take the I2U2, and the deeper engagement with the Middle East. How do you see India now playing a sizable role in this particular region? Traditionally, it's been our oil guarantor, so to say, given that we are the second largest importer of oil. But do you see that relationship now changing, evolving to something more?
I do, because I think we're seeing new, fast-paced, emerging, diversified economies in the Middle East. They're looking to trade both east and west of the Gulf. IMEC represents a new Silk Road era, potentially, something that captures the imagination of countries in the Gulf, in the Far East, as well as in Europe. Let's not forget, in the era of the Silk Road, that began in this part of the world. It didn't begin in Europe. It was an era in which civilization was developed from the Middle East and from the region that borders India. I think this could be an exciting era. We need peace. We need a degree of stability that we don't have now. But I think India has to be part of linking the Eastern Mediterranean to Southeast Asia, and through that to the West, to Western Europe and beyond.
Absolutely. Mr. Staples, thank you so much for taking out the time and speaking to NDTV.
It's great to be with you.
Thank you, sir.